we had to be careful of labels because we're not just one thing. And we also have to be careful with labels because we don't want to kind of pigeonhole people based on other people's expectations or what, unfortunately, a lot of people might not understand something like dyslexia or ADHD. At the same time, a label gives us community.
Hello, everyone. We are Sonia and Nick, and this is Dyslexia Journey. And today we are excited to welcome Dr. Benjamin Powers to the show. Dr. Powers is the Executive Director of the Southport School, an independent day school for neurodiverse children in grades 2 through 8 who have language-based learning differences and/or ADHD. Powers also serves as president of the Dyslexia Foundation and as director of the Haskins Global Literacy Hub at Yale University. Dr. Powers, welcome to the show.
Well, good morning. Thanks so much for having me today.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So let's just start at the beginning. We're really curious about how you became interested in neurodiversity, or we could call it cerebrodiversity, and dyslexia specifically.
Sure. So my trajectory was actually pretty interesting. I was somebody who struggled a little bit in school. I was in the resource room early on in elementary school, and I had, bumps along the way. And after college, after graduating from college, I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. I actually thought I was going to go into business. And by chance, I actually ended up substitute teaching one day and fell in love with this idea that we could really have the opportunity to change the conversation in the classroom. At that time, I knew nothing about neurodiversity or what we talk about at the Southport School, cerebrodiversity. And then I stumbled on, or actually, I'll correct myself, my mom stumbled on an advertisement for a school called the Kildonan School, which was at the time one of the oldest schools in the country for children with dyslexia. I knew nothing about dyslexia, but I applied and started working there. And as soon as I started working with those students who primarily had either dyslexia or also maybe ADHD, I just really fell in love with working with those kids who were these amazing thinkers, but who had really struggled in mainstream learning environments. And it just resonated with me and some of my challenges in school. And ever since then, I've been really passionate about working with kids with learning and attention issues.
That's interesting. So there is sort of a personal connection there.
That's right. So I am diagnosed with what's called combined type ADHD. So if people aren't familiar with combined type ADHD, there are typically three types of ADHD. There's ADHD hyperactive type, ADHD inattentive type, and then combined type, which is both of those things. So what I like to say is it makes me a really good guest at a dinner party.
Great. Yeah. So I guess tell us a little bit more about the Southport School now, where you are currently.
Sure. So we are nestled in the village of Southport, Connecticut. It's just this beautiful little enclave in Fairfield County. And we serve about 125 students in grades 2 through 8 who have a learning or attention issue like dyslexia or ADHD. Those are our two main identifications. Our third most common identification would be auditory processing disorder. And so our students are coming to us typically after they've really struggled to thrive in a mainstream learning environment. And so they're with us for about 3 years. We do really intensive language remediation. We do a lot of work around executive functions. And maybe most importantly, we do a lot of work around self-advocacy skills, self-emotion, self-advocacy, self-efficacy, self-esteem, all the kind of those holistic pieces so that when our kids leave us, they don't just have the toolkit filled for the academic side, but they also have the social emotional side built so that they can really be empowered to achieve their full potential.
Yeah, that's so important. We talked about our daughter on this show a lot, who is dyslexic, and she's in high school now. And her experience in early elementary school and in the public school system was very damaging to her self-esteem, to her sense of herself as an intelligent person. Capable of doing well in school. And it really took a while to kind of undo that damage from the early public school experience.
Well, I'm just thinking, because you said No, I was just going to say, because you said, that you usually are getting people, not necessarily. So we had usually people either, weren't diagnosed as a child who we talked to, or it was more like that kind of situation. We did have our most recent Dyslexic Voices person who was diagnosed really early and never had that, right?
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're mostly having people who already had the challenges and struggles. So I assume that makes it then, more of a challenge, because there can be school resistance and all that kind of thing.
That's exactly right. It's, one of the exciting things is with all of these efforts around screening efforts, early screening for dyslexia, because we know we can screen children very, very early. We can disrupt that kind of wait to fail model that's been in place for so many years. But unfortunately, at least for the present moment, that's still most of the kids that we serve. And I think, like you're talking about with your daughter, that's unfortunately a pretty typical experience where our students have come from an environment where they've felt less than because they've struggled with some aspect of school that seemingly comes easy to other kids. And so all of a sudden they're feeling like, what's wrong with me? They feel a sense of shame. Their cortisol levels are through the roof by the end of the school day. And what I would say is one of the most exciting things at a school like ours is that when our students are dropped off in the morning, and it's a school and these are kids, so we have our good days and our bad, but the majority of time our kids are coming out of the cars excited. I mean, kids are naturally curious learners, and so it resonates with me because by the time I hit middle school, there were moments where I really did feel less than. I really could not understand why I was struggling with what things that just seems kind of easy for other kids sitting to my left and to my right. And so to have an environment where our students can come in, feel championed, feel like they have teachers who understand them, but maybe most importantly, have classmates, who have similar relative areas of strength and relative areas of deficit in their profile, really gives them that huge boost to understand that they're not alone, that there's community there for them.
Right, right. So so it sounds like this whole socio-emotional sort of healing almost process is one, if not the foundational part of success for the students. I'm just curious, what factors do you see as contributing? I'm sure there's so many, to the success of the students at Southport.
So, it's really kind of multiple prongs. One is, and I think this is most critical, everything we do at the Southport School is based in research. So whether that is academic programming, whether it's social emotional programming, our firm belief is that kids get 9 months for about 13 years of school, and that's it. So we can't waste any of that time using strategies or theories that just aren't grounded in science. So everything we do across the board really has a strong emphasis in research and evidence. And so it's really multiple pieces. One is really that whole piece of teaching them in the academic classroom in a way that is, again, based in evidence and research that resonates with who they are as learners. And so we take research-based approaches, we leverage that with techniques we know work really well for students who have learning and attention issues, like we chunk things down, we lay out a lesson plan very clearly at the beginning of class. I'd say a second big piece of this is thinking about the co-curricular time. So opportunities outside of like the traditional 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, to give our kids opportunities to engage and explore in outlets that are, they're still academic in nature, but they're less traditionally academic, like the arts and music and movement. And then the other piece, and again, perhaps the most critical piece, is underlying all of that with the real strong basis in being able to self-advocate. And so all of our students at the Southport School have an advisor, and that advisor is like their personal champion. And so our students really have unfettered access to be able to reach out to that advisor if they're struggling at any point during the school day. And the job of that advisor is to be that champion and to support that student, but also to help that student build that bridge to that independent self-advocacy so that by the time they leave us, they're comfortable and confident in being able to approach a circumstance or situation where they might feel like they're struggling or they might feel tension or difficulty, so that they can kind of flip that script and be able to engage and be able to really feel confident in tackling and navigating their school day.
That's so important. And I think it's something that we, even just maybe more recently, have tried to emphasize in distinguishing, I guess, the need for the bridge, right? Because so it's like, of course, self-advocacy is important. I think most people see that, but it's like there's the stage where you sort of have to teach that and like be the one who's doing the advocating, but then getting them to it. So it's not just like you're like go self-advocate, but you're actually teaching it, right?
That's exactly right. And, I think part of that underlying that is that notion of resiliency. And so the challenge with resiliency, of course, is that we don't want to add yet like another layer or expectation on our students, our kids who are already struggling because, they're neurodiverse learners. At the same time, we really want to help prop up that resiliency and strengthen that resiliency so that they feel that confidence and that comfort. And then alongside that, build that toolkit that says, hey, it's not just about speaking out. It's about speaking out for yourself in a way that you can communicate what your needs are to be successful. And our mindset is, imagine if every kid could walk into class on the first day and say, hi, I'm Ben, and I struggle with things like task initiation. So, having a scaffolded framework for how, long-term projects is going to be really helpful for me. And I promise you that if I have that structure in place, I'm really going to work so hard and do my best and be successful in your class. So, giving our kids and helping them develop, that roadmap so that they can really be in that position to articulate those things is just so critically important. And what's so amazing, I think, to us is our experience. We've been doing this work at the Southport School for 40 years now. What we've realized over, especially the last decade, is that all the things we do for our kids, when I say our kids, kids with learning and attention issues, it's not just good for our kids, it's good for every kid. All the things we do in our school really would benefit all learners.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme too in what we talk about often on this show, that a lot of the a lot of the sort of techniques and whatever for working with dyslexic kids, I mean, all kids can really benefit from. I want to dig into one point here. One thing that we've observed and discussed and also covered in interviews with other people is that this idea of self-advocacy, requires some level of sort of identification. Like I am a dyslexic student, I am a dyslexic person, and this is what I need, because of my dyslexia. Kind of, how do you handle that? That sort of, I guess, it's like a labeling question and an identification question, right?
It's a great question, and it's something I think as a parent, and I've got 4 kids myself. As a parent and as an educator, and being in this field for about 25 years now, it's a really critical question. We have to be really careful with labels. And one of the things we know is that if you have something like dyslexia or ADHD, it's more than likely, you're likely have some type of comorbid. I know that's an awful sounding term, but you likely have some other co-occurring condition. So if you have ADHD, there's a high likelihood that you may have some type of reading issue that goes along with that. So, we have to be careful of labels because we're not just one thing. And we also have to be careful with labels because we don't want to kind of pigeonhole people based on other people's expectations or what, unfortunately, a lot of people might not understand something like dyslexia or ADHD. At the same time, a label gives us community. And so, a lot of people struggle with this term learning disability. I struggle with it because, our kids aren't learning disabled. They might be reading disabled or attention disabled in some ways, but they're not learning disabled. But at the same time, that notion of disability is what gives our kids community. It gives them rights, legal rights. And so understanding that identification, and we're very particular about this term, it's, we think about this as identification. Understanding their identification is critically important, not just so they can have that the access to those legal rights, but also that community. And the other thing is, it's really important that as part of that identification, the student or child really understands, what does that mean? And I don't know if you've seen this, but a lot of times kids go out, they get tested by a third party. That third party then meets with the parents. They go over all of this comprehensive multi-day testing. And unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of that isn't always absorbed, by parents. It's overwhelming, or maybe it's not communicated effectively. And one of the things we found highly effective is to actually be able to talk through a student's learning profile that, yes, you have these relative areas of deficit, and that's why you qualify for this identification. But the flip side is you also have these other relative areas of strength. And so, helping our students learn, they're not just one thing, there's a whole picture here. And how can we think about those relative areas of strength to help offset those relative areas of deficit? So I think if you go about it the right way and really kind of dive into it and engage with the child and help them really understand what that means, and as part of that, with the parents or guardians as well, that can make a substantive difference.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right to me.
Yeah, you're right. It's interesting. I don't feel like that breakdown often happens. So it's interesting.
It's
I
a
wonder
lot
why.
to
I don't know
absorb,
why.
right? I
But
mean,
yeah.
we're parents, right? I mean, I remember when my second daughter was born, she had like a minor heart issue. And of course, you're kind of panicked as a parent and you want to try to learn about it. But, I'm not a heart cardiologist. So, I have to be reasonable with my expectations. And so it's the same thing with a learning or attention issue. Most parents don't have a background in that. And so to be in a doctor's office or, a psychiatrist's office, getting this download of all this information is overwhelming. And so, having time to unpack that and really understand what it means, short term, long term, and then being able to really be able to support your child with that, and in a way, it's kind of truly a gift because how many kids really know what their learning profile is? So, in a
Yeah.
way, that in and of itself can be used as a relative area of advantage.
Yeah, definitely. So what's the kind of usual path of students at the Southport School? You said you usually have them for about 3 years, is that right? And then what do they do kind of after that? Do they go to public school? Like, are they kind of set up for public middle school and high school with accommodations, or what's kind of the common, if there is a common path there?
Sure. So yeah, the typical students here for about 3 years. That might be adjusted based on. And some of our kids are just super dyslexic. On that bell curve, they might be more dyslexic or more ADHD, and so they might need a little more time. It also really depends on when they come in and enroll at the Southport School because we want good moments of transition. So that timeline might be adjusted a little bit. Our students really, it's about a 50-50 split. Perhaps the slight majority go on to public schools, but almost all of our students are going to either, public schools or what we would call kind of mainstream independent schools. Some of our families are independent school families by nature. Some of our families realize that by the nature of their child's learning or attention issue, perhaps an independent school with smaller classes, even though it's a continued major investment for them as a family, maybe that's just the better pathway for their child. One thing I would say, based on experience of helping students transition from a school like ours into a more mainstream public school, or even my own experience with my children, the older they get, and especially with high school, in some ways, the easier the transition because especially as you go into something like high school, there's just typically in most environments, just so many more choices in terms of like coursework, those co-curricular classes. And the emphasis is at that point typically off of learning like skills and more really just super focused on content, which allows, in our experience, it's allowed our kids who might still need like accommodations to be able to have something like extended time or, books on, we call them books on tape, but, audio versions of text or text to speech kind of software. By the time they get to high school, the high school teachers seem not really to care about that so much relative to like middle school or elementary school teachers. They just need to get the kids through the content. And so we found that a lot of our kids, especially when they're transitioning late middle school or really into high school, that bridge can be a lot easier in that regard. So but again, our kids, I would say the most typical struggle for our kids, our classes are 4-to-1. A large class for us would have 6 kids. So, we work on that with the kids before they transition. We try to pull classes together so they have kind of a larger dynamic experience before they go in. So, there's sometimes an initial kind of jolt when they're going into a larger environment. But once they get settled and they feel confident applying the skills they've learned with us, they typically just really flourish in those mainstream environments.
So this is making me curious, going back to just, even before the actual transitioning would happen. I'm curious about, is are the accommodation, because you mentioned, the remediation being like pretty strong for reading. I'm curious how much there's the sort of a balance between that and using accommodations right from off the bat. And one thing I wanted to pull in from earlier too, because you mentioned the good balance with having the other classes with curriculars. I'm curious, like, because it's, it just can be so exhausting with all of it. Even so, like, I'm curious about homework actually too, like, and how that's handled.
That's right. Yeah. So a few different points there. One is our kids are all getting intensive language remediation. As the primary approach at the Southport School, we're using the Orton-Gillingham approach. And so every single one of our teachers, whether they're doing reading instruction or not, every one of them is trained the same way, including the Orton-Gillingham approach. And so, and we really layer in, if it's necessary and the child is going to benefit from it, we will layer in levels of accommodation depending on the task or the subject. So if in a tutorial class where we're doing that intensive intervention, if the goal is to really focus on reading, we're not going to use an accommodation. We're going to focus on building that skill through the intervention. But if a child, outside of that, like in a literature class or a content area class, if we can use an accommodation as a ramp into material that is commensurate with their intelligence, that's going to be a huge advantage. One of the disadvantages for kids with a reading disability, for example, is that they're oftentimes, because of their difficulty with the printed word, they might be limited in their access to that reading material that is commensurate with their intelligence, and that's going to slow things like their vocabulary growth, and it's going to make their exposure to different types of text, and access to different types of content more limited. And so we want to ramp them into that, accessibility so that they continue to develop all those other skills like, a typical classmate would. So, accommodations can be really important, not just when we're transitioning a student out of the Southport School, but also, when they're here, so that, again, we can really develop the skill set through strong, intensive instruction, and then also provide that accommodation as they are, accessing the other areas of content so that they don't have to be held back in their academic growth.
Yeah, that's so important. That's something we've talked about as well. How it's so frustrating, I think, for a lot of dyslexic kids, which is our experience, other kids with other learning differences, to really spend all their time on remediation and not get exposure to the more interesting stuff that's out there. And like in the case of our daughter, I mean, she struggled with reading. I mean, when she was, I don't know, maybe 9, 10, her reading level was still not that great, but we were reading books like Agatha Christie mysteries to her out loud that she could, very totally orally follow, even though it was antiquated language and whatnot. So we're definitely strong believers in that approach, sort of dual approach to things.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, a lot of times I'll encourage families, reading. Again, it's true for all kids, so it benefits everybody. Reading to kids in and of itself is just an amazing opportunity to give kids access to, again, vocabulary, content, genre, modeling, all those great things. And so, reading to kids, using audiobooks, all those different opportunities can be a huge lever up for them, and really help them close the gap. So, doing that is, in my mind, just exactly the right thing.
Yeah, and to follow up on one other thing, how do you handle homework at that
Yeah.
level? I know it's okay.
No, I kind of threw that one in there because I didn't want to forget, but it's
Yeah.
really its own question.
I knew there was a third thing there.
Question. Yeah, it's really its own question.
Homework is a good question. I think, it's like the reading wars in a way, where we've kind of vacillated between things like whole language and phonics. In homework, we've really kind of gone up and down, where there's been a mindset to like really overload kids with homework, and then pull homework completely away. And then, homework to me is a really good opportunity to reinforce skills that you're teaching in the classroom. And so those can be a wide variety of skills. Part of that is helping students develop the structure to do independent work outside of the classroom. Part of that is to, literally reinforce maybe skills that were taught as part of the day. So especially when our students are younger, we're using homework as that opportunity to practice and reinforce. we do not teach new material using homework. We teach new material in the classroom. So that's really, really important. The second thing is we provide scaffolded, structured time during the school day for students to work independently. And so every one of our students, even starting in second grade, has a block of time, a study hall block, where there's a teacher who's actively proctoring that. It's not, it's not a teacher who's just sitting reading the newspaper. They're actively proctoring that study hall. And so students have that experience to be able to work independently, but also ask for help, either from the teacher in the classroom or the way we structure our schedule. The way we do that, it gives them an opportunity to say, hey, I'm struggling with this math question. Can I go out and ask Mr. D, for help with that? So it also gives them that self-advocacy piece. When they're really young, second, third grade, we really don't want them taking homework home. We want to build that notion of homework in that study hall. And then as they get older, we want to we do want to increase that dosage a little bit, where they're starting to take work home outside of that study hall block. So they're gaining that experience at home. They're developing that structure independently at home, the time, the space. We're giving tools and tips to parents so that they can help them be successful with that. Because in our minds, the most important thing for our kids with homework is that they're identifying that they can be successful with it. For a lot of our kids coming in, maybe the experience with homework was not one of success. It was one where they got a worksheet or they got material, they brought it home and they didn't know what to do, or it was teaching new material and they were stuck. And then they either wouldn't do it, or they wouldn't feel confident in how they were doing it. And then they'd go in the next day and get in trouble, or, just really feel badly about themselves. So we really want to inspire that level of authentic success and have them feel really comfortable and confident with that kind of independent work.
I've never heard homework talked about that way before. That's really makes it sound so beautiful. It's actually it's just, not really, at most it'll be like that it's a necessary thing, with almost like the necessary but evil tacked on, I feel like. But yeah, I mean, it's an opportunity for success.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we like kind of crush kids with this stuff sometimes, where again, they're not, I always ask parents, like, well, how was your child when they went to preschool? And they're like, oh, they loved it. They were excited, I mean, not all the time, but most of the time they're excited. They're curious. I mean, kids are curious by nature. Kids are good by nature. And so what are we doing wrong if by first and second grade, they don't want to learn anymore? Maybe there's a very, very small percentage of kids, who are just wired that way. But, I would say 99.9% of kids are not wired that way. So what can we do to kind of, keep that spark going? I don't think it's terribly hard. I think it's just how we kind of reframe that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think this is a good time maybe to shift the discussion a little bit. So you mentioned somewhere that I saw that you like to keep one foot in the classroom and one foot in research. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the research that you do?
Sure. So, I think one of the most exciting things in my career has been that ability to kind of bridge that research with practice. And so when I first started teaching kids with dyslexia and ADHD, I learned a lot. I had a ton of professional development, but it was all on the implementation side. And I really didn't understand how was this formed, what was the background. And so over the years, I've been very fortunate to be involved in the research community. And in 2017, I was invited to be part of Haskins Labs, which does a lot of really groundbreaking work in the area of speech and language development. And so I'm able to contribute on the education side and think about that intersectionality. And as an example, one of the projects that I'm involved with right now is a large NIH-funded grant where the president and director of research at Haskins, Ken Pugh, he is doing this huge project to really understand individual differences in kids using fMRI imaging. And so how can we think about what has to activate in brain to be able to have a student primed for intervention? So why are some kids responding to, in an example of somebody with dyslexia, why do we see some kids get intervention and just start to really take off? Why do we see some kids really take much longer? Or, a very small percentage of kids we call treatment resistors. So, understanding the distinct individual differences in brain and understanding things like the pathways between orthography and phonology and semantics. How do we understand better the more efficient pathways and what's going to work? And how can we adjust the way we teach our kids in terms of the dosage, in terms of the emphasis in certain areas of that scaffolded reading instruction. So that's to me why the research is so important, and we're really lucky to engage, certainly with a lot of colleagues at Haskins, at Yale, and UConn, but then also like last 2 weeks ago, we just had a team from the Florida Center of Reading Research from Florida State University up, doing data collection. And so, we've got a lot of different partners where we're either contributing to the collection of research data, or, we're doing research, ground level research to really help improve our understanding of the learning brain.
Yeah, I didn't realize all that was going on. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's my next question is if you have found anything particularly surprising in the research. I'm actually just surprised to hear that level of research is going on. But have you had any particular findings that were surprising?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things that's happened, and 40 years ago, in order to do dyslexia research or this research on ADHD, you literally had to dissect brains. And so Dr. Norm Geschwind, who was up at Beth Israel, he's really known as the father of cognitive neurology. And back then, in his lab in the late 70s up until the early 80s, imaging research wasn't really, it was just a very nascent, part of the field. And now today, we can image brains using fMRI, FNIRS, we can use EEG, and actually the Global Literacy Hub that I'm involved with, we've got 2 in-school EEG labs that are directed by Dr. Nicole Landy. It gives us so much more insight. And I think one of the things that it's done is it's really helped validate, hey, when we're talking about dyslexia and we're talking about ADHD, these are real things. We can literally see distinct brain level differences. And not only between like typical brains and a brain with somebody with dyslexia, but we see differences in brain even with things like differences between somebody with ADHD and autism, and things like inhibitory controls. So I think it's really helped us understand, for example, like somebody with dyslexia, one of the interesting findings is that their brain is lighting up in a lot more areas. So their brain's having to do more work to access the printed word than a typical brain, because their pathways just aren't as efficient. And so, understanding that and kind of learning these things, and watching this imaging research come out over the years really helps give a lot of perspective to not just how we can be better in the classroom with our kids, but maybe a little more empathy around the struggles that they're having, with the academic school day.
Yeah, definitely makes it real when you can see it like that. I mean, we know, of course, anyway, just from seeing the struggles, but
Yeah.
sometimes there's all these other mixed things happening in how we think of it too. So
Yeah. And so I guess the sort of follow-up question to that is what's your experience in sort of combining the research and the education? So I mean, what I mean by that is like bringing research findings back into the classroom and into the school. Like you mentioned early on that everything at the Southport School is research based, all the educational philosophy and approaches. Is there anything specific? Do you have like a specific example of that, of maybe some recent findings that you've done or that you've read about that you've introduced into the school that you've found successful?
Sure, I can think of a great example. Over the years, we've developed a metacognitive approach to executive functions. And so, a lot of people, when they talk about executive functions, they talk about planning and organizing. And planning and organizing, certainly, that's a key part of executive functions, but there are other really important pieces like, task initiation, task perseverance. There's a lot of different components, the behavioral controls, the emotional controls. And so, over the years, as we've developed this approach, the executive functions, we've updated and changed it, both as we've seen the research develop. So, as there's been updates to our understanding of the executive functions, because it is a relatively nascent field, we've shifted and made changes to, in real time, to how we, talk about and label the executive functions in the classroom. And then over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been doing a data collection with Dr. Lori Cutting at Vanderbilt University, where We've been doing audio capture in the classroom. We worked with Dr. Cutting's lab and the School of Engineering at Vanderbilt to develop a code book using machine learning, where we can pick out executive function phrasing and phraseology to really see like how many impressions are we getting of those different types of executive function, from teacher talk, from student talk, from interaction, so we can see like literally class by class, like where is the area of emphasis with these kids in executive functions, and how might that help us understand how we need to shift our area of emphasis with that as we continue to help our students develop their executive function skills.
That's so amazing. I mean, just the level of the
Yeah.
individualization we're talking about here is really amazing, and just of adapting. I'm curious to know, because this just sounds so wonderful, but of course not every student is going to
Yeah.
your school. How I'm wondering how you see adapting some of these techniques or some of these research findings for other schools, whether private or public.
That's such a great question. Unfortunately, a school like ours, maybe, just inaccessible for families, whether it's geography, whether it's finances. We live in an area and work in an area in Fairfield County where, you know, there's just much more access to these types of things. Not for everybody, of course, but just in that region. And so, what we've really focused on over the last 6 or 7 years is doing exactly what you're talking about. How can we take what we've learned from working with these kids year over year and export that into other schools? And so, since 2018, we've been working with both public school systems and independent schools, to help bring out the types of teaching and learning that we've really honed, through our experience and through research. And so, I can give you a really specific example. Over the past 2 years, we're entering our third year. We've been down working in the 35th largest school district in the United States, Anne Arundel County in Maryland, which is serving a really broad and diverse community of learners. And we've trained and coached and mentored teachers across there. I think they have 82 or 84 elementary schools. And this past year alone, that's impacted 887 students. And so when you see the kinds of outcomes these students are having now that they've got teachers, who in part were trained by us and coached by us, and you see the contribution of that to learning outcomes and seeing them help close that gap, it's really remarkable. So through the Southport CoLAB, we've really been able to take what we've learned at the Southport School and make that really more accessible to a lot more students, educators, and families.
That's great. Yeah, that's so important. Following up on that, that's really great. That amazing that you're doing that training and getting that those techniques and philosophy out there. What sort of, for people who might be watching this video, who might be kind of new to this, or may have worked with dyslexic kids but may need some guidance, like what advice do you have for teachers, all the teachers out there, for working with dyslexic kids?
So that's a really important question. As we all, or maybe people have heard, there's this whole movement for the science of reading. And I'm really excited about that because it's really making sure we connect our understanding of research and evidence and how we connect that to educators in the classroom. At the same time, we have to be really informed consumers, because the whole science of reading movement, it sounds great, but we have to be really careful about how those things are either packaged or what is being put in front of teachers. So I think one of the most important things teachers can do is really make sure they're working with and working with the administration in their schools to really understand, like, where is this coming from? Are the materials, are the resources, are the things that we're being given, are they grounded in research? Unfortunately, there's a lot of resources out there. And, like Teachers Pay Teachers is an example. There are some great resources on there. There are also some resources on there that are just not grounded in science. And so making sure we're really understanding that, what we're taking into the classroom and working with kids actually does align with what we understand, that body of knowledge from something like the science of reading. I think the other piece is, really understanding that these distinct differences we see in kids when we have a child in our classrooms who's identified with a learning disability or who we might think may be at risk. Understanding that these are valid constructs. Unfortunately, for a long time, I think people may have seen things like dyslexia or ADHD maybe as like an excuse. And that's been an unfortunate kind of stereotype that's existed for far too long. And so, if a child does have that identification, it takes a lot to get that identification. It is not easy. As we know, kids have to go through like multiple rounds and days of testing. And so if a kid is coming into the classroom with that, it's likely they actually do have that. And again, this is grounded in a thorough body of really valid research. And so if we can, think about that in a way to have that empathy and to, be mindful of that when we're working with kids and understanding that, maybe a student in the classroom who's struggling and it might come off like they're being resistant or oppositional or, to give them, I like to say, the kids who come to the Southport School, it's like a car. You need spark, you need fuel and you need air for a gas powered car to run. Our kids come with plenty of spark and plenty of fuel. They just need that air. And so, if we can give them that space, that air, to have that ability to be able to show what they really can do, that's going to help reduce that stress, that anxiety. It's going to help reduce those cortisol levels, and it's going to give them the opportunity to thrive and show who they really are as learners.
Yeah, definitely. That's a message we can't get out enough, I think.
I really like the car analogy, needing air. It's good.
Well, so this may be the same thing you would want to say to the general public, because that's probably good advice for everyone. But I'm curious if you have any final words, including anything that you would want the general public to know about dyslexia or perhaps other, ADHD as well, and all of these cerebro-diverse issues.
I think, maybe the most important thing to understand is, and we've covered this, thoroughly, that there are distinct brain level differences, not just between somebody who is neurodiverse or cerebrodiverse and somebody who's not, but also within the realm of these different identifications. So we do see really distinct brain level differences. And, we're really in that space where it's important to recognize that certain things like reading or like the kind of traditional classroom setting, those are relatively recent inventions in humanity. And, if you think about it, I always say to people, if you're on a safari in Africa, you want the tour guide with ADHD because that person is likely going to be the first one to spot the lion before it kind of jumps out and eats you. So, even with things like there have been studies that have shown, early migration, a lot of the DNA that's been collected of the early humans who migrated, a lot of them show genetic code for having ADHD. And those studies have been replicated. And so, if from an evolutionary perspective, it's probably likely that there's a reason these things exist. We don't know the full picture on that. We've got to be really mindful of doing good research to understand why these things are. But there are likely reasons that these things exist. And unfortunately, when we look at, the timeline of humanity, again, something like reading, something like the classroom setting, these are really recent changes to environment. And when you think about something like dyslexia, that's a challenge with it's an environmental challenge. It's a challenge with this expectation that reading is the gateway to information and the gateway to independence that did not exist a few hundred years ago for most people. And so, the ADHD challenges we see in the classroom, it's an environmental challenge. And so, we have to be really thoughtful about understanding that these things are brain-based and that they likely, in many cases, are a reflection of the environments we're creating for our kids.
Yeah, that's important.
I really like the way that implicitly reframes it from being not a problem with the child, but a problem with the system.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right. I mean, again, there's, and this is the whole notion of cerebrodiversity. It's this, it's the notion that we are better off as a species because of our collective heterogeneity. And, if you think about something like autism, we needed people to specialize, like, especially as we were learning to like grow crops, we needed specialists in those areas as humans to be able to survive and thrive. We needed people with ADHD to migrate so that we could find, they needed that stimuli to go find new places, to be able to push, humanity forward. And so, again, we don't have all the knowledge and understanding about that we would like to have. And that's why research is so important, because we have so many unanswered questions still. But I do think it gives us a lens to say, hey, let's be mindful that we're not discounting those relative areas of strength that these students can bring into not just the classroom, but also, to our world. And I would say, one last thought on that is, one experience I think is really exciting is thinking about the changes we sometimes make for kids in the classroom. I'll give you like a really quick, specific example. My kids, I put a kitchen island in our kitchen, and my kids were tipping in the stools. And so I took the stools away and I put in swings. And the kids, kids need to move. They need their vestibular system activated. But I didn't want my kids to get hurt, and so putting in the swings, de-escalated the risk of them falling. Me kind of getting frustrated, like, oh no. But it also made my job so much easier cleaning underneath those swings, rather than having to move the stools around. And so a lot of times the changes, the shifts we can actually make to improve learning for kids with learning and attention issues, again, can actually not just benefit other kids, but actually our whole environment. And so if we look for those opportunities, it's really an advantage for everybody.
That's a wonderful place to end on today, with both really holistic and, just such a positive and even thinking outside the box sort of aspect there. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for everything you brought here, lots of these interesting, and the research you do and for what you're doing in the school. And we really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the work you do to help share the news and really help advocate for our kids and adults with learning and attention issues. And thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate it.